It was early November in New York City, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones. The subway station at 59th Street Columbus Circle was crowded, people rushing home, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion. The late evening rush meant most trains were packed. People pushed in without glancing around, headphones in, heads down. And that night, Donald Trump was just another face in the crowd. There was no entourage, no cameras, no gold cufflinks. He wore a dark overcoat, black gloves, and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. Most people didn't recognize him. He didn't want them to. He had gotten into the habit of riding the subway occasionally, alone, without security. He said it kept him grounded. No one believed it when he said it, but it was true. Some nights, he just wanted to be around regular people. Hear what they talked about. See their faces when they weren't filtered through his office windows or TV screens. Tonight was one of those nights. He had left his penthouse at Trump Tower, taken the elevator down by himself, and walked into the night like anyone else. He stepped onto the train when it arrived. It was a crowded car, but he didn't mind standing. As the doors slid shut, his eyes moved over the passengers. There was an empty seat near the middle, and he stepped toward it. Next to the seat was an older woman. Her posture was stiff. She wore a heavy gray coat, and her hands gripped her designer handbag tightly on her lap. As Donald moved toward the seat, she turned her head slowly, eyeing him with an expression that was impossible to misread. Disdain. Contempt. She shifted slightly, sliding her coat into the seat beside her. "This seat is taken," she said coldly. Donald stopped in his tracks. He looked at her, then at the empty seat. "I don't see anyone sitting there," he said calmly. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. The woman's lips tightened into a line. "It's taken," she repeated, louder this time. She hugged her purse closer, as if he were about to steal it. Around them, a few heads turned. People noticed the exchange, but no one said a word. Trump didn't move for a moment. He was used to confrontation, but there was something different about this one. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, and his face was half covered. She had no idea who he was. And yet, there was something familiar about the way she looked at him. As if he was beneath her. As if he didn't belong. He had seen it before. A long time ago, when he was a young man walking through neighborhoods that didn't welcome his kind. And long before that, stories his mother told him about being an immigrant girl from Scotland, working as a maid, laughed at for her accent, dismissed because she didn't have the right clothes or the right last name. The woman shifted again, making it clear the seat wasn't for him. "Why don't you try the next car?" she added sharply. Then, under her breath, but loud enough to hear, "People like you don't belong here." There it was. A simple sentence that hit harder than any shouting ever could. Donald took a breath, but before he could speak, a young man sitting 2 seats down stood up. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "you can have my seat." He stepped aside and gestured toward the now empty spot. Trump gave him a nod, his expression unreadable, and took the seat without another word. But something had shifted in the car. Attention hung there, heavy and uncomfortable. The woman crossed her arms and stared out the window, as if the world had nothing to do with her. A few passengers exchanged glances, whispering. Some of them started to recognize him, not from his coat or his cap, but his profile, his hands, his voice. Minutes passed. Donald sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his back straight. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he was thinking about how fast people judge, about how easily a stranger can decide your worth, and how little people understood about where he had come from. They saw the money now. They saw the buildings and the headlines. They never saw what was behind it. They didn't know about Mary and McLeod Trump coming to America with nothing but a suitcase and a will to work. They didn't know how she scrubbed floors in strangers' houses before she ever saw the inside of a ballroom. They didn't know what it was like to be told you don't belong. He did. He knew it better than anyone on that train. And then, as the subway sped through the tunnels, he realized something. The woman next to him still had no idea. She was sitting there, holding her bag like it was armor, assuming she was above the man next to her. But this was just the beginning. The subway car rattled onward through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, its wheels grinding against the steel rails with a hollow screech at every turn. The passengers inside swayed with the motion, some gripping metal poles, others shifting weight on tired legs. A faint smell of damp concrete and old metal hung in the air, mixing with perfume and the stale breath of people who had been awake too long. But all Donald Trump focused on was the woman sitting stiffly beside him, her jaw clenched, her expression frozen into something between pride and disdain. She hadn't spoken again since telling him to move. She didn't need to. Her body language said enough. She sat upright, her shoulders squared, as if maintaining territory in some invisible war. Her handbag remained tightly clutched in her lap, and she stole brief, cutting glances at him, always looking away before their eyes could meet. It was a reflex born of habit, as if she'd spent a lifetime believing certain people simply weren't worthy of acknowledgement. Across from them, the young man who'd given up his seat now stood silently, his back pressed against a support pole, his eyes on his phone but not really looking at it. His attention kept flickering toward Trump and the woman, reading the situation like the rest of the car had started to. Some people whispered to each other. Others avoided looking at either of them entirely. But something in the energy had shifted, the kind of shift that made you aware you were witnessing something important, even if you didn't know what it was yet. Donald sat still. His hands rested on his knees. He could feel the weight of every stare, but it didn't faze him. Not yet. He knew how to wait, how to hold his ground until the moment was right. It was something his mother had taught him long before he ever sat behind a desk on Fifth Avenue or signed his name on skyscrapers. He remembered how she used to walk him to school when they still lived in Queens. Before the headlines, before the wealth, before he became the man people thought they knew. She told him that people would always look at him and decide who he was before he opened his mouth. She said it had happened to her, too. Fresh off the boat from the Hebrides, with an accent thick enough to cut through steel, working jobs no one else wanted. People treated her like she was less, until she showed them otherwise. He thought about that as he sat in silence. He thought about her voice in his ear, telling him to stand tall, but stay quiet until the time was right. Not everything had to be a spectacle. Sometimes, the real power came in letting people show themselves first. And then it happened. The train slowed as it approached the next station. A faint robotic voice announced it over the intercom, but it was barely audible over the screeching brakes. People shuffled, preparing to get off or move to make space. The older woman next to him suddenly stood, gathering her things with sharp, jerking motions. She muttered something under her breath that wasn't hard to catch. Trash always thinks it deserves a seat. The words hit the space between them like a slap. Clear, deliberate. No mistake in what she meant. A few passengers flinched. Others stared. The young man who had offered his seat earlier looked up from his phone, his expression darkening. Donald didn't move at first. He stayed seated, letting the weight of her words sit in the air like a slow burn. Then he stood, not because he had to, but because he decided it was time. He adjusted his coat slowly, methodically, like a man with all the time in the world. His gloves came off one finger at a time, and then he pulled the baseball cap from his head. The reaction was immediate. Someone near the door gasped softly. Another passenger, a woman with a briefcase balanced on her lap, lowered her coffee and stared. Now they saw him. He turned, facing the woman who had spoken. Her face shifted the second recognition dawned. The blood drained from her cheeks, and her mouth fell open slightly. She took a small step back as if bracing for something. But Trump's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He spoke in the same even tone he had used 1,000 times before. In boardrooms, on construction sites, in courtrooms. Calm, controlled, direct. You think you know who belongs where, he said, his eyes locked on hers. But you don't. You don't know who built these streets, who cleaned these floors, who raised the families that run this city. You think you're better because you sit here in a coat you think makes you important. Her eyes flickered, darting toward the other passengers, hoping someone would step in. No one did. You didn't know who I was, he continued. You didn't care. But it's not about who I am. It's about who you are. The silence that followed was heavy. The train had started moving again, but it felt like it wasn't going anywhere. The woman fumbled for words, but none came. She adjusted her purse again, her hands shaking. Then, unexpectedly, an older man seated farther down the car spoke up. His voice was rough, tired, but steady. My mother used to scrub floors for people like you, he said, looking at the woman. She had hands cracked and bleeding from scrubbing your floors. You're lucky she's not here to see this. Another woman, maybe in her 20s, nodded quietly. Mine cleaned hotel rooms. Voices joined in, low but firm. No yelling. No anger. Just truth. The kind of truth that carried weight because it was lived. And Donald Trump stood there, saying nothing now, letting them speak, because they didn't need him to. But the woman who had tried to make herself bigger by making someone else small was now the smallest person in the room. The subway car rumbled forward, its wheels clattering against the rails like an old rhythm no one really heard anymore. But inside, the atmosphere was charged with something that couldn't be ignored. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the weight of decades of unspoken things had finally landed on the passengers' shoulders. No one shifted in their seats. No one reached for their phones. They just watched. Quiet. Waiting. The woman stood frozen, her fingers clenching the strap of her handbag so tightly the skin around her knuckles paled. She didn't speak. She didn't look at anyone. Her stare was fixed on the sliding doors at the far end of the car, though it was obvious she wasn't seeing anything. Maybe she was hoping the ride would end soon, that the moment would slip away, unnoticed. But it wouldn't. Not this time. Donald Trump remained standing. He didn't lean on the pole, didn't brace himself as the train swayed. His stance was steady, composed. His coat hung straight, his chin level. And even though his face was unreadable, there was something in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't done yet. Not with her. Not with this. He waited another moment before he spoke again. His voice was calm, quiet, but the words hit hard. "You didn't see me for who I am," he said. "And that's fine. But you didn't see yourself for who you are either." The woman's lips trembled slightly. She didn't answer. Couldn't. "You thought I didn't belong here," he continued. "On this train. On this seat. In this city. People like you always think they get to decide who belongs." He paused. Not for effect. For truth. "But you don't." Another jolt shook the car as it rounded a bend. No one moved. A young woman near the back cleared her throat, but she didn't speak. She just watched, her hands wrapped tightly around the straps of her backpack. Donald Trump let the silence stretch again before his voice came low and measured. "I've built things you've walked through. Sat in rooms you'll never step into. Signed checks bigger than you've dreamed of. But none of that gives me more right to be here than anyone else." He didn't have to name anyone. The message hung there. "And it sure doesn't give you the right to decide who deserves respect." The words settled in like dust after demolition. Heavy. Unavoidable. Finally, she spoke. Barely. Her voice cracked on the words. "I didn't know." But it wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even a reason. It was just a weak attempt to fill the air with something, because silence was too much to bear. Donald shook his head, not in anger, not in mockery. Just truth. "You didn't care." The train slowed as it approached another station. The lights flickered as they often did when it braked hard. The mechanical whine echoed through the car. But nobody stood up. Nobody reached for the door. She did, though. She stepped toward it, her shoes scuffing loudly against the floor as she moved. Her shoulders hunched now, as if she'd physically shrunk under the weight of it all. But before she could step through the door, an older man sitting near the exit shifted forward in his seat. His voice was low but clear. "You can run if you want, but you'll still be the same when you get off this train." She froze. She didn't turn around, but she didn't move forward either. "You think this is about him?" the man went on, nodding toward Trump. "It's about you. The choice you make next." No one said anything more. No one needed to. The doors opened. She stood there, one foot on the platform, one still inside. Then slowly, stiffly, she stepped back. Back inside. Back to the car full of strangers who had seen her at her worst. When the doors shut, she finally turned around. Her eyes were red now, but it wasn't just anger. Not anymore. She walked over to Donald Trump slowly. Not as someone making a grand gesture, not for show. Just because she had to. She stopped about 2 feet away. And without lifting her chin, without looking him in the eye, she said it. Quiet. Flat. Real. "I was wrong." He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. She turned and took the same seat she'd refused him earlier. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of the train wheels grinding against the tracks took over again, filling the space with a sense of movement. Not just the literal kind. Donald stayed standing for a while longer before finally stepping over to the young man who had given up his seat earlier. "Thank you." The guy just nodded. No need for more. The moment had shifted again. From confrontation to understanding. From judgment to reflection. And everyone in that subway car knew they wouldn't forget it. The train rattled through the darkness of the tunnel, its lights flickering faintly against the dull metal walls outside the windows. Inside, the mood had changed. Not dramatically, not in some sweeping, cinematic way. It was quieter. Still, like everyone was trying to process what had just happened and how they fit into it. Donald Trump didn't sit. Not yet. He stood near the door, one hand gripping the rail loosely, the other resting by his side. He didn't need to say anything more. The silence he left behind was enough. The woman who had blocked him earlier sat stiff in her seat, her hands folded tightly on her lap, knuckles white, as though gripping them harder might stop them from shaking. Her face had changed. The arrogance, the entitlement, the superiority she had worn like armor were gone. All that was left was someone stripped down to the truth of herself. She had judged. She had looked down on a stranger because of assumptions that had nothing to do with who he was. But it wasn't just about him. That had become clear to everyone. She had made judgments all her life. This was just the time it all unraveled in front of people who wouldn't let it slide. A few seats away, an older man with a scar running down his cheek gave a slow nod. He hadn't said anything earlier, but he'd watched. He'd seen everything. The same look of recognition was in the eyes of others scattered throughout the car. They all knew what this was. A moment that was never supposed to happen, but once it did, it couldn't be taken back. The young woman who had given up her seat earlier glanced toward Donald again. Her expression was hard to read. Respect, maybe. Curiosity, definitely. And something more. She wasn't surprised by his reaction. She was surprised that no one else had reacted the way he had sooner. At the far end of the car, the doors opened again, and a group of teenagers stepped in, laughing too loudly, pushing each other around, oblivious to the quiet weight in the space. But they stopped when they noticed the mood. One of them glanced at the woman who had refused Donald the seat, then at Donald himself. He gave a half-smile, the kind teenagers give when they recognize someone they didn't expect to see in a place like this. But he didn't say anything. He took a seat with his friends, and they fell quiet like everyone else. Donald finally moved. He stepped forward and took the seat next to the young woman who had offered hers earlier. He didn't say anything as he sat. Neither did she. But there was something between them. A silent agreement. They'd both done what they thought was right. One had acted first. The other had followed through in his own way. The woman who had caused it all kept her eyes down. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, like she was trying to control something boiling under the surface. It wasn't anger anymore. It was shame. But not the kind that made people defensive. The kind that made them reevaluate everything. The train jerked again. Another station loomed ahead, lights flashing outside the windows before the brakes squealed and the car came to a shuddering stop. The doors opened. Two people stepped out. No one stepped in. The young woman beside Donald cleared her throat, but she wasn't talking to him. She was looking at the older woman across from her. "You getting off?" she asked. Not cruelly, just directly. The woman shook her head. She stayed seated. She wasn't running this time. Donald watched her for a moment. No malice. No pity. Just an understanding. She had something to figure out, and he wasn't going to do it for her. As the train doors closed and the ride continued, a slow shift settled over the space. People relaxed their shoulders. Someone pulled out a book. Someone else checked their phone. Life, as it always does, kept moving. But the moment had left its mark. For Donald, it was just another chapter in a long history of moments like this. Some public, some private. Most, no one ever saw. But this one had witnesses. And witnesses talk. The train hummed along its tracks, carving through the cold steel of the city's underground. It was quieter now. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but full of something heavier. A kind of reflection. Even the rattle of the wheels seemed softer. People had returned to themselves, but none of them were quite the same as when they boarded. Donald Trump sat still in his seat, his posture upright, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the floor of the car. His hands rested on his knees, unmoving. His presence remained large in the space, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't brash. It was steady. He didn't glance at the woman who had refused him a seat earlier, though he could feel her glancing at him. Twice, maybe 3 times, as if trying to summon the courage to say something, but not finding the words. She didn't have to. Not yet. The young woman beside him shifted slightly in her seat. Her fingers tapped softly against the edge of her bag. She wasn't nervous. It was more like she was thinking, weighing something. She glanced over at him, and for a second, they locked eyes. She gave him a nod. Just a nod. No smile. But it said enough. He returned it the same way. At the far end of the car, the older man with the scar slowly stood up. He walked to the door and exited at the next stop without looking back. But not before giving Donald the same nod the young woman had given him. Simple, quiet, as though to say, I saw it, and I get it. More people filed off as the train slowed and stopped at each station. It was just another Thursday night for most of the city, but for the people who had been in that subway car, something stuck. The woman who had caused the commotion finally stood. Her movements were stiff, her hands gripping the metal rail longer than necessary before letting go. She stepped toward Donald with the kind of hesitance that didn't come from fear, but from the weight of regret. She didn't try to explain herself. She didn't offer some long-winded apology that made it about her. She stopped just beside him, her voice low. I was wrong. That's all she said. Donald nodded once, looking at her this time. His expression didn't soften, but there was a certain acceptance in his eyes. Not approval, not forgiveness. That wasn't his to give yet. Just recognition that maybe this moment would change something in her. Maybe it wouldn't, but she tried. That counted for something. She turned away after that and exited at the next station. No one followed. No one needed to. It wasn't their story to carry anymore. As the train approached the final stop, the young woman beside him spoke quietly, almost absently. They're going to talk about this. Donald looked at her, his brow lifting slightly. Not about who you are, she added. About what you did. He gave a small nod. The kind of nod that came from knowing how these things worked. They always talked. It didn't matter if they got it right. What mattered was what they took from it. The train pulled into the last station. The lights above flickered once. The doors slid open with a mechanical sigh. Donald stood, adjusting the strap of his simple leather bag across his shoulder. He stepped off the train and into the station without looking back. The young woman followed behind, taking the stairs up toward the street level. Their paths split at the top. She turned left. He turned right. On the surface, the city hadn't changed. Cars still honked. People still rushed. Neon signs still flickered in dusty windows. But somewhere beneath all that noise, something had shifted. At least for a few people. Donald walked down the street with the same steady pace he'd had his entire life. The kind that said he knew where he was going, even if the rest of the world didn't. He passed a diner, its lights warm and inviting through the glass. He paused, looked inside. For a second, he stood there, watching people laugh over coffee, others eating alone but comfortable in their solitude. It was simple, honest. It was the kind of place where no one cared who you were as long as you were decent. He walked in, sat at the counter, ordered a coffee. The woman behind the counter smiled at him like he was anyone. Not Donald Trump, not a billionaire, not a former president, just a man ordering coffee. He nodded his thanks. And for once, that was enough.